October 30th, 1503. Inside the holiest palace on earth, 50 naked women crawled across sacred marble floors while cardinals watched in silence. The Pope himself was laughing. But what happened after midnight? The forced consummation witnessed by dozens would haunt the church for centuries. This is that story. If this story shocked you, subscribe right now. We bring you the most disturbing, unbelievable, and real events from history every single week. Don't let YouTube hide this channel from you. Hit subscribe and the notification bell. You'll regret missing what comes next. In the autumn of 1501, Lucrezia Borgia was 21 years old. History would remember her as a femme fatale, seductress who poisoned her enemies and manipulated popes. But the truth was far darker. She was not a villain. She was a victim. Lucrezia was the illegitimate daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. From the moment her father took the papal throne, Lucrezia's life was no longer her own. She became a tool, a bargaining chip, a piece on the chessboard of Renaissance politics. Her first marriage was arranged when she was just 13 years old. She was wed to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, to secure an alliance with the powerful Sforza family of Milan. But when that alliance no longer served the Borgia interests, the marriage was annulled in 1497. The Pope declared it invalid. Lucrezia had no choice. Her voice did not matter. Her second marriage came quickly. In 1498, she was married to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bistegli. This time, something unexpected happened. Lucrezia fell in love. Historical records suggest she genuinely cared for Alfonso. For a brief moment, she had something resembling happiness. It did not last. In July 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He was stabbed multiple times but survived. Lucrezia personally nursed him back to health in the Vatican. She stayed by his side. She feared what would come next. A month later, on August 18, 1500, armed men entered Alfonso's chamber. They strangled him to death in his bed. The order, most historians believe, came from Lucrezia's brother, Cesare Borgia. Alfonso's death was politically useful. That was all that mattered. Lucrezia was devastated. Contemporary accounts describe her grief as overwhelming. She withdrew from public life. She refused to eat. She wept constantly. But grief was a luxury she could not afford for long. The Borgias needed another alliance. And so, Lucrezia would marry Aguindod by 1501. Lucrezia lived in the apostolic palace within the Vatican. She woke each morning in lavish chambers surrounded by Renaissance art and gold-leafed ceilings. To the outside world, she appeared to be royalty. But inside the walls, she was a prisoner. She suffered from nightmares. She would wake in the dark, trembling, remembering Alfonso's face. She knew she was powerless to stop whatever her father and brother decided next. She had learned the price of resistance. Silence was survival. In December 1501, the announcement was made. Lucrezia would marry for a third time. Her new husband would be Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, one of the most powerful families in northern Italy. The wedding would take place in the Vatican itself. Alfonso d'Este wanted nothing to do with his marriage. Lucia's reputation terrified him. Two of her husbands were already dead. He knew the Borgias were dangerous. But his father, Duke Ercole I d'Este, understood the reality. Refusing the Pope meant war. Refusing the Borgias meant destruction. And so Alfonso agreed. He would travel to Rome. He would marry Lucrezia Borgia. And on the night of October 30th, 1503, inside the holiest palace in Christendom, something unthinkable would occur. When the papal envoy arrived in Ferrara in late 1501, Alfonso d'Este knew exactly what the message would contain. Pope Alexander VI was proposing a marriage between Alfonso and his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. It was not a proposal. It was a command. Alfonso was 25 years old, a skilled soldier and the heir to one of Italy's most respected dynasties. He was educated, cultured, and politically astute, and he was terrified. Everyone in Italy knew about Lucrezia Borgia's marriages. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had fled Rome in fear for his life. His second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, had been murdered in the Vatican itself. Now, Alfonso d'Este was being offered as the third. He tried everything to escape. First came the diplomatic excuses. Alfonso sent letters to Rome citing prior commitments, expressing concern about timing. suggesting delays. The responses from the Vatican were polite but firm. The marriage would proceed. Then Alfonso claimed illness. He sent word that he was too unwell to travel. Pope Alexander sent his personal physician to Ferrara to examine him. The physician reported back that Alfonso was perfectly healthy. Alfonso's father, Duke Ercole d'Este, reached out to allies across Italy. He appealed to Venice, to Milan, to Florence. Could anyone intervene? Could anyone help them refuse the Pope? The answer was always the same. No one dared oppose the Borgias, because by 1501, the Borgia family stood at the absolute height of their power. Pope Alexander VI controlled the wealth and authority of the Catholic Church. He commanded papal armies. He could excommunicate kings and topple governments. He was the most powerful religious figure in Europe, and he used that power without hesitation. His son Cesare Borgia was even more feared. At just 26 years, old Cesare had become one of the most ruthless military commanders in Italy. He had conquered cities, murdered rivals, and crushed rebellions with shocking brutality. He commanded a personal army of 10,000 men. His reputation alone was enough to make rulers surrender. The message to Duke Ercole was clear. Accept the marriage, or Ferrara would burn. Ercole understood. He had no choice. In December 1501, he ordered his son to travel to Rome and marry Lucretia, Borgia and Alfonso Velet. What else could he do? The journey south took weeks. Alfonso traveled with a small escort of Ferrari's knights, riding through winter, cold and muddy roads. Every mile closer to Rome felt like a step toward his own execution. He knew he might never return home alive. When Alfonso finally arrived at the Vatican in late December, he was received with overwhelming ceremony. Pope Alexander personally welcomed him. The halls were filled with cardinals in crimson robes, nobles in silk and velvet, musicians playing fanfares. It was opulent, it was grand, and it was a trap. The weeks leading up to the wedding were designed to break him. Alfonso was forced to attend elaborate banquets where courtesans were paraded in front of him, while cardinals watched and laughed. It was humiliation disguised as entertainment. Cesare Borgia attended these events, sitting in silence, his cold eyes fixed on Alfonso. The message was unspoken but clear. You are powerless here. Alfonso's movements were constantly monitored. Guards were positioned outside his chambers under the pretense of protection. His Ferrari's knights were separated from him and housed in distant quarters. He was isolated, controlled. Watched. Cesare made thinly veiled remarks about the fates of Lucretia's previous husbands. He spoke of loyalty, of the consequences of betrayal, of how accidents could happen to anyone. Alfonso understood the truth. This was not a marriage. It was a demonstration, a display of Borgia dominance, a message to every noble family in Italy. We can do whatever we want, and you cannot stop us. By the time October 30th, 1503 arrived, Alfonso d'Este was a man with no way out. The doors were locked, the guards were in place, and the wedding night was about to begin. October 30th, 1503, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out across Rome at dawn. It was the wedding day of Lucretia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este. The city stirred with anticipation. Crowds gathered in the streets outside the Vatican, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bride inside the apostolic palace. Lucretia was dressed in a gown of golden silk embroidered with pearls. Her blonde hair was braided and woven with jewels. She looked like a Renaissance painting come to life. Beautiful regale. Trapped. The ceremony took place in the papal chapel, a sacred space adorned with religious art and flickering candles. Cardinals lined the walls in their scarlet vestments. Roman nobles filled the pews. Everything appeared proper. Everything appeared holy. Pope Alexander VI himself presided over the ceremony. He stood at the altar in white and gold papal robes, speaking the sacred Latin vows that would bind his daughter to Alfonso d'Este in the eyes of God and the Church. His voice was steady. His demeanor was solemn. He blessed the union with holy water and called upon divine grace. It was a grotesque irony. The man performing this sacred ceremony had already planned what would happen after midnight, but in that moment, the wedding seemed almost normal, almost hopeful. Alfonso stood beside Lucretia and repeated the vows. Lucretia's voice was quiet but clear. Guests smiled. Musicians played. For a brief moment, it felt like any other aristocratic wedding in Renaissance Italy. Then the ceremony ended, and the guests were led to the Borgia apartments for the wedding banquet. The Borgia apartments were among the most beautiful rooms in the Vatican. The walls were covered in frescoes painted by Pinturicchio, depicting biblical scenes and mythological gods. The ceilings glowed with gold leaf. Chandeliers held hundreds of candles, casting warm light across the hall. Long tables were arranged and covered with food: roasted boar, whole pheasants still dressed in their feathers, pyramids of fruit imported from across the Mediterranean, flagons of wine from the finest vineyards in Italy. The wealth on display was staggering. The guests took their seats: cardinals in crimson, Roman aristocrats in silk and velvet, diplomats from Venice, Florence, and Milan, all carefully selected, all loyal to the Borgias or too afraid to refuse the invitation. At the head table sat Pope Alexander, Lucrezia, Alfonso, and Cesare Borgia. The atmosphere was festive. There were toasts. There was music. Lutes and violas played courtly melodies. Servants moved between the tables pouring wine. It seemed like a celebration. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to change. Pope Alexander drank heavily. His voice grew louder. His laughter became more unrestrained. He gestured wildly, telling crude jokes that made the cardinals shift uncomfortably in their seats. Cesare sat silent, watching, waiting. Then, around 10 o'clock, Cesare stood. He gave a subtle signal to the guards stationed along the walls. The heavy wooden doors of the Borgia apartments were closed, locked. More guards moved into position, hands resting on the hilts of their swords. No one could leave. The guests noticed. Conversation faltered. Nobles glanced toward the exits. Cardinals exchanged nervous looks. Something was wrong. Then the side doors opened. 50 women entered the hall. They were courtesans, dressed in expensive gowns of velvet and silk, adorned with jewelry. They were beautiful, but their eyes told a different story: fear, shame, resignation. The room fell silent. Guests stared in confusion. This was not part of a normal wedding banquet. Pope Alexander rose from his seat. His face was flushed with wine. He smiled broadly and raised his arms in a grand gesture. "Now," he announced, "the real entertainment begins." At his command, the 50 women began to undress. One by one, they removed their gowns. They let the fabric fall to the marble floor. Within minutes, all 50 stood completely naked in the heart of the Vatican. The reactions were immediate. Cardinals turned away, crossing themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. Some nobles stood as if to leave, but guards stepped forward, blocking their path. Sid Alfonso d'Este sat frozen, his face drained of color. He could not believe what he was seeing. This was his wedding. This was the Vatican. This could not be real. Lucrezia stared down at the table, silent tears streaming down her face. She did not look up. She could not. The 50 naked women began to move through the hall, dancing between the long banquet tables. Their shadows flickered against the sacred frescoes. The music continued. The candles burned, and the night had only just begun. The spectacle escalated. Servants entered the hall, carrying large wicker baskets filled with chestnuts. At Pope Alexander's command, they scattered the chestnuts across the marble floor. Hundreds of them rolled and tumbled between the tables across the sacred ground of the Apostolic Palace. Then the Pope stood and announced the rules of his game. The 50 naked women were to crawl on their hands and knees across the floor. They were to move between the legs of the seated cardinals and nobles. They were to collect as many chestnuts as they could carry. The woman who gathered the most would receive prizes: bolts of silk, gold coins, jewels from the papal treasury. It was degradation turned into competition. The women dropped to the floor. They crawled. They moved between the legs of princes of the church, gathering chestnuts one by one, clutching them against their bodies. The sound of their hands and knees on marble echoed through the hall. Some of the younger cardinals, drunk on wine and caught in the madness of the moment, began to laugh. They cheered. They shouted encouragement as if watching a sport. Others sat motionless, heads bowed, eyes closed. They could not watch, but they could not leave. The doors were still locked. Above it all, the frescoes of biblical saints and angels gazed down from the walls. The contrast was unbearable. Sacred art, holy symbols, and beneath them, this grotesque theater of humiliation in the corner of the room. A man named Juan Bachard sat with a ledger and quill. He was the papal master of ceremonies, a German cleric whose duty was to document every official event in The Vatican. He had served under multiple popes. He had recorded coronations, conclaves, diplomatic receptions. Now he recorded this. His hand trembled as he wrote. The ink smudged. He knew what he was witnessing. He knew that what he documented would either be buried forever or become the most damning testimony in the history of the Church. At the head table, Alfonso d'Este sat in stunned silence. His mind could not process what was happening. This was his wedding night. This was the Vatican. This was impossible, and yet it was real. Beside him, Lucretia no longer cried. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow. She had stopped feeling. Somewhere inside herself, she had shut down. It was the only way to survive. Pope Alexander and Cesare Borgia sat in elevated chairs, watching the spectacle unfold. They leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices. They were placing bets, wagering on which woman would collect the most chestnuts. After what felt like hours, the game ended. The exhausted women were given their prizes: silk, gold, jewels, payment for their humiliation. The Vatican clocks began to chime. Midnight was approaching, but the chestnut game was only a prelude. What the Pope would order next would cross the final boundary of human dignity. Midnight struck. The Vatican clocks tolled 12 times, their deep bells echoing through the apostolic palace. Pope Alexander VI rose from his seat. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward him. He made his announcement. The marriage between Lucretia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este must be consummated tonight. Not once, 3 times. And all present must witness it to ensure the union's legal validity under canon law. This was not a request. It was a papal command, backed by armed guards standing at every door. The room fell into horrified silence. Even Cesare Borgia, who had orchestrated countless acts of brutality, showed a flicker of surprise at his father's audacity. Cardinals sat frozen, unable to believe what they had just heard. This crossed every boundary of decency, morality, and human dignity. This was not Renaissance politics. This was something else entirely. Alfonso d'Este sat motionless at the table. He was a prince of Ferrara, a man of honor and noble blood. But he was surrounded. Caesar's soldiers stood along the walls, hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The message was clear: obey or die. He turned to look at Lucretia. She was trembling. Her face was pale. Her eyes were empty, staring at nothing. She looked like a woman who had already left her own body. There was no choice. Alfonso and Lucretia were led to an adjoining chamber. It was normally used as a reception room, but for tonight, it had been furnished with an ornate bed draped in crimson silk. The doors to the chamber remained open. Guests were positioned in the outer hall with a direct view inside. This was the ultimate violation, not just of their bodies, but of their privacy, their dignity, their humanity. What followed is documented in historical records, including the diary of Juan Brachard, the papal master of ceremonies, who was present that night. Alfonso, psychologically shattered and under threat of death, complied. Lucretia lay motionless on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Silent tears streamed down her face. Dozens of eyes watched from the doorway, witnesses to an act that should never have had witnesses. Her mind dissociated. She had survived her murdered husbands. She had endured years of being used as a political pawn, but this destroyed something deeper, something that could not be repaired. When it was over, Cesare Borgia entered the chamber. He inspected the bed with cold, clinical detachment. Then he turned to the guests and announced loudly that the first consummation was complete. He ordered Alfonso to wait 1 hour. Then it would happen again. The guests sat like stone figures in the outer hall. No one spoke. Cardinals murmured prayers under their breath, asking for forgiveness for what they were witnessing. Some of the courtesans who had been forced to perform in the chestnut game now wept openly, not for themselves, but for Lucretia. They understood her suffering. They were all prisoners in this nightmare. The doors were still locked. The guards were still watching. No one could leave until the Pope allowed it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the second consummation occurred. Alfonso moved mechanically, his mind barely present. Lucretia had completely dissociated. Her body was there, but her mind had fled, somewhere unreachable. Cesare supervised again. He confirmed completion. He ordered them to wait once more. Dawn began to break over Rome. The first pale light filtered through the windows of the Borgia apartments. The third and final consummation was ordered. Cesare entered afterward and declared the marriage irrevocably sealed under both canon and civil law. No annulment would be possible, no escape. Pope Alexander VI raised a glass of wine in triumphant toast. He smiled. He had achieved his goal. The morning sun illuminated the aftermath. Empty wine bottles littered the tables. Chestnuts were still scattered across the marble floor. Exhausted courtesans lay slumped in corners. In the chamber, Lucretia remained motionless on the bed, her eyes open but empty. Alfonso sat at the edge, head in his hands, his entire body trembling. The cardinals filed out silently, one by one. They did not look at each other. They were no longer just witnesses. They were accomplices to a crime against humanity. The wedding night was over. News of what happened that night spread across Europe like wildfire. Diplomatic dispatches were sent in cipher from Rome to Venice, Florence, Milan, Paris, and London. Ambassadors wrote in carefully coded language, but the shock was unmistakable. The Venetian ambassador recorded, "What occurred in the Vatican surpasses the darkest days of imperial Rome." The scandal became ammunition for critics of the Church. Reformers who had long accused Rome of corruption now had undeniable proof. Years later, Martin Luther would cite the Borgia banquet as evidence that the papacy had become morally bankrupt, an institution that had lost its way. The fates of those involved were tragic, swift, or both. Lucretia Borgia lived the rest of her life as Duchess of Ferrara. She never recovered psychologically from that night. She devoted herself to charity work, patronage of the arts, and religious piety. She sought redemption for sins she had never committed. Contemporary accounts describe her as melancholic, kind, and marked by a deep, unshakable sadness. Her marriage, too, Alfonso, was cold and distant. How could it have been otherwise? They had children together, but there was no intimacy, no warmth. The trauma of their wedding night had built a wall between them that could never be torn down. Lucretia died in 1519 at the age of 39, during childbirth with her 8th child. Witnesses reported that in her final moments, she called for a priest and spent her last hours in prayer. Her final words were said to be, "I am ready to finally be free." Alfonso d'Este left Rome immediately after the wedding, traumatized and broken. He never spoke publicly about that night. He avoided Lucretia whenever possible. He buried the memory as deeply as he could, but it never left him. Pope Alexander VI died in August 1503. Less than a year after the banquet. Some historians believe he was poisoned. It would be an ironic end for a man who had allegedly poisoned so many of his enemies. Cesare Borgia's power collapsed after his father's death. Without the protection of the papacy, his enemies closed in. He fled Italy and died in 1507 during an ambush in Spain. His body was dismembered by his killers. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Juan Burchard's diary survived. His meticulous documentation of Vatican ceremonies, including the events of October 30th, 1503, was rediscovered in the 17th century. He still shocks readers today. He remains the primary historical source for what happened that night. The scandal had lasting consequences. It fueled the Protestant Reformation, which sought to break away from what reformers saw as a corrupt and morally bankrupt Rome. The Catholic Counter-Reformation that followed was, in part, an attempt to erase the memory of families like the Borgias and restore the Church's moral authority. The banquet of chestnuts became synonymous with Renaissance excess and papal corruption. It is still studied today as one of the darkest episodes in Church history. But this story is not just about sexual depravity or moral collapse. It is about the abuse of absolute power. It is about human beings used as tools in political games. It is about how the most sacred places can become stages for the darkest acts when power is unchecked. It is a warning. Power without accountability destroys humanity. And history's darkest chapters are written when those in authority believe they are above all law, all morality, all human decency. 5 centuries later, this night remains one of history's darkest warnings. That power corrupts absolutely, and that the greatest evils are often committed in the holiest places. If this story impacted you, share your thoughts below. And remember, history's darkest chapters teach us what humanity must never repeat.